Welcome back. Last time we looked at the encounter of Jesus with the Samaritan woman and the conversion of the town of Sychar in Samaria. We examined Jesus' return to Galilee through the region of Samaria, his encounter with the Samaritan woman in which he spoke to her of living water and true worship. As a result of this, the woman became an evangelist, announcing the good news to her townspeople, who then come to Jesus and express faith in him. In addition, there was a short discussion with the disciples on food, in which Jesus used two common proverbs to explain the situation. In our current session, we continue with the 5th chapter of the Gospel of John and the beginning of the 6th chapter. In particular, we'll look at the 3rd and 4th signs of the 7 signs narrated in the first part of the Gospel. The 3rd sign is the cure of the paralytic at the pools of Batha. This narrative leads to a controversy with the Jews on Jesus' actions of judging and giving life. We conclude with the 4th sign, the multiplication of loaves. The locale of the narrative again switches from Cana in Galilee to Jerusalem, in particular the pools of Batha in Jerusalem. These pools were known for their curative features, and so the porticos of the pools were lined with sick people. One in particular was a paralytic whom Jesus encounters and cures in this narrative. This narrative bears similarities to the cure of the paralytic in the 2nd chapter of Mark's Gospel, but also there are major differences. Let's begin by looking at a map of Jerusalem. In particular, let's look to the north of the Temple Mount. This is an area that's known as Bethesda or Batha, translated from the Hebrew as House of Mercy. It's known for its 2 pools, known as the sheep pools. Murphy O'Connor notes that after AD 135, when Jerusalem was paganized into Aelia Capitolina, the sanctuary expanded into a temple. Votive offerings of the 2nd and the 3rd century AD in gratitude for cures show that it was dedicated to Serapis, or Asclepius, the Roman Greek god of healing. The actual narrative of the healing can be divided into sections. The first describes the setting of the sign. The second is an encounter between Jesus and the paralytic, which contains the actual miracle. The third is a discussion between the cured man and the Jewish authorities. The fourth, Jesus encounters the man again. The fifth, the cured man now goes to the Jewish leaders and tells them that it was Jesus who heals them. And finally, the final scene, the Jewish leaders hail Jesus before them to answer for his act. The narrative begins with the usual connective after these things. That is, the events of the cure of the centurion's son in Cana. Then we're told that there was a feast of the Jews which is unnamed. Interpreters have tried to determine which of the feasts it would be, but to no avail. The only information that we're given is that it is a Sabbath, and that comes in the 10th verse. Nevertheless, Jesus returns to Jerusalem. Then the narrator turns to the specific place in Jerusalem, that is, the sheep gate, where there is a bathing pool, which is called in Hebrew Batha, having 5 porticos. We hear of a sheep gate in the Old Testament in Nehemiah 3:1, 3:32, and 12:39. Clinton notes that in Jesus' day, these may have been pools where sheep would have been washed prior to being taken to the temple for sacrifice. These pictures from the model of the city of Jerusalem show how it's possible for the pool to have 5 porticos. In actuality, there were 2 pools, a northern pool and a southern pool divided by a portico down the middle. Actually, archaeologists have found that the northern pool is also slightly elevated from the southern pool. Since the 1960s, archaeological excavations have uncovered remains of a pool with 5 covered colonnades precisely in the area of the sheep gate, as described by Nehemiah. According to Van Walde, the remains show there existed a pool with 2 basins, lying north and south, surrounded on 4 sides by porticos, with an additional portico dividing the pool in the middle. This is what the south pool looks like today. The columns mark part of the temple to Asclepius that was constructed in the 2nd century. This is a picture of the north pool, which also had been turned into a Byzantine church in later centuries. After describing the area, the narrator turns attention to those who were gathered in the porticos around the pools, a multitude of the sick, the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed. The original word meant those who were wasting away, and several ancient manuscripts changed it to paralytics. In other words, people who would be considered as outcasts in society. As a result, those who wished to maintain ritual purity, and many of the upper class, would avoid such an area. But this is where we find Jesus in the midst of them. The next verses are regarded by many as inauthentic, as they do not appear in the earliest manuscripts of the text, and they provide an explanation for the sick being in the portico. They read, "waiting for the movement of the water." It was thought that the waters of the pools received an infusion of spring water from below, and it caused the waters to move. This was interpreted by many as an angel of the Lord at certain times descending into the pool and stirring up the water. Then it was believed that the first sick person to enter into the pool after the stirring of the waters would be healed of whatever disease he or she had. Next, the key personage of the narrative is introduced. He's introduced simply as a certain man, and then described as being ill for 38 years. Now, Brown implies that the number does not mean that he was at the pool for 38 years, but that his illness lasted that long. Some have suggested that the number 38 is a symbolic number, as it's given as the length of the wandering in Israel in the desert in Deuteronomy 2:14. Jesus catches sight of him lying there, and having known that he was lying there for a long time, addressed him with a question. "Do you wish to become healthy?" One would expect that the man would be happy that Jesus saw him and was willing to do something for him. But he was not. Rather, he responds to Jesus with a complaint. "Sir, I don't have a man that when the water might be stirred, he might put me into the water, into the pool. Instead, while I'm going in, another goes before me." This answer provides the reason for the manuscripts mentioned above, adding the verse regarding the angel as a further explanation of the man's complaint. In any case, the man does not see Jesus as being of any help whatsoever, and definitively does not then see him as possibly curing him. He centered on the pool as his only source of cure. Jesus' response to the man's complaint is to command him to arise, take up your mat and walk, thus curing him. The Greek word for arise is agera, which is the same word used for raising from the dead and resurrection. Thus, Jesus commands the man to embark on a new life, cured of his paralysis. And the cure is immediate. The man became well, and he took up his mat and walked. All that was necessary was the word of Jesus. No touch, nothing special. But there was also no real faith on the part of the paralytic. His attitude is quite different to the people in the previous two signs. We are then told a rather ominous fact. The day was the Sabbath. It's ominous for two reasons. First, Jesus cured on the Sabbath, which is contrary to the law. And second, he told the man to carry his mat on the Sabbath, which is also contrary to the Sabbath law. Hence, Jesus has violated the Sabbath and led the cured man to do the same. As a result, the Jews call the cured man in to question him. First, they remind him that it is the Sabbath, and it's not permitted for him to carry his mat in accordance with the Mishnah, particularly Tractate Shabbat 7:2. The man defends his action, blaming Jesus, the one who made him well. That one said to me, "Take up your mat and walk." So the Jews asked him about the identity of the one who caused him to violate the law. Who is the man who said to you, take up your mat and walk? Note, in their question, they make no reference to the cure, only a violation of the Sabbath law. The editor now inserts a comment telling the audience that the man who was cured did not know who it was that cured him, and Jesus had slipped away, since there was a crowd. It has been noted that this exchange shows some extraordinary things. First, the paralytic now healed has absolutely no idea of who it was that healed him. And second, the Jews were not moved by the fact that a paralyzed man for 38 years was cured, but only were interested in the fact that he broke the Sabbath law. Then the scene changes. After these things, that is, after the encounter of the man with the Jews, Jesus finds the man in the temple precincts, in the Hieron. Now, Jesus could have happened to bump into the man in the temple, or he could have intentionally sought him out. Jesus reaffirms what has just been done for the man. Behold, you have become well. No longer sin, lest something worse happen to you. This presents a common view of sin in the period. That is, it was a result of sin, either the sin of the person themselves or the sin of their parents. Interpreters are generally agreed that worse does not refer to a more serious ailment, but rather an eternal judgment. As Beasley Murray puts it, something worse that could happen to the man would be to finish up in Gehenna. Van Walde concurs. He says this ominous statement is undoubtedly meant to refer to the possibility of judgment for his sins. The man, having encountered Jesus, now returns to the Jews and announces that it was Jesus who had made him well. In other words, he turns Jesus in. Certainly it seems that he is not grateful to Jesus for what he has done. He complies with answering the question now in 5:12. However, he has entered into an encounter with the light, and contrary to the Samaritan woman, he's not allowed the light to enlighten him. He's not accepted the light. As we shall see, he will stand in sharp contrast to the next healing sign in John, the blind man of chapter 9. The cured paralytic now vanishes from the narrative, and it becomes a dialogue between the Jews and Jesus. Again, the editor inserts a comment to give the reason for the Jews' animosity toward Jesus. On account of this, where this refers to the cure of the paralytic, and Jesus telling him to carry his mat, the Jews were pursuing Jesus because he did these things on the Sabbath. What's interesting is that the Greek verb dioko, which is translated here as pursue, can also be translated persecute. Clearly, this is the beginning of overt hostility of the Jews toward Jesus. The only reason that the Jews wanted to see and question the cured paralytic was to get at Jesus, who was the real object of their pursuit. Jesus has tangled with the Jewish leaders before in the Gospels because of his violating the Sabbath law. But John's Gospel takes it to a new level. Jesus does not answer with a reason for his actions. Rather, he answers going to the very nature of God and God's work. My Father is working up to now, and I am working. In saying this, Jesus shows that just as the Father is not actually inhibited by the Sabbath law, neither is the Son. This line of argument corresponds to the synoptic saying that the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath that we find in Mark 2:12. The Jews correctly interpret Jesus' response and thus seek even more to kill him, which shows a major escalation. Two reasons are given. First, he broke the Sabbath law and led another to do so. But second, now, more significantly, he was saying that God was his Father, making himself equal to God. That's blatant blasphemy. So the Sabbath charge now becomes minor in relation to this. The Shema, prayed twice daily by the devout Jew, affirmed that God was one. Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael, the Lord our God is one. For the Jews, Jesus' statement makes him equal to the one God. And for them, 1 + 1 is 2, not 1, which is outright blasphemous and heretical to say it's 2. Jesus' response to the Jews takes the form of a discourse comprising the remainder of chapter 5 of John's Gospel. This discourse elaborates the twofold work of the Sabbath, which was traditionally reserved to God, to give life and to judge. There are no readings from this discourse in the Sunday liturgy, and so we now shall move on to the fourth sign, the multiplication of loaves. The 6th chapter of the Gospel of John is one of the key chapters in the text. It begins with a Johannine narrative of the multiplication of loaves, and then is followed by the 5th sign narrative, the walking on water. This paves the way for the great bread of life discourse, in which is contained the Johannine theology of the Eucharist. Let's move then to our discussion of the multiplication narrative. The narrative begins simply with the standard connective, after these things. Arnold notes that the phrase is quite vague. A period of time of up to 6 months could have passed between the encounter in Jerusalem and these events. Then the action is narrated. Jesus departed across the Sea of Galilee. And then a further name is given to the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias. More than likely, Jesus crosses the sea from the west to the eastern shore. And a great crowd was following him, because they had observed the signs that he was performing for the sick. So what Jesus has been doing in Jerusalem and earlier on in Cana has now drawn a rather sizable crowd, wishing to see what further wonders this Jesus might perform. This is a relief map of the Sea of Galilee. As you can see, it is a basin surrounded by mountains. The width is approximately 7 miles, and in the current climate that's diminishing, and the length is approximately 14 miles. Given the mountains surrounding it, one can understand how when the wind swoops down, the water in the sea can become very choppy, and storms can be hazardous. In modern times, the site of the multiplication is known as Tabgha, which derives from the Greek heptapagai transliterated, which means 7 springs. Now, the way heptapagai becomes Tabgha is interesting. Linguistically, there is a law called Grimm's Law of Declining Consonants. The first syllable of the hepta drops, leaving ta. Then, according to Grimm's law, a P sound can morph linguistically into a B sound, thus tab, and the guy becomes ga, thus tabga. Now, the area of Tabgha as it is today is pictured in this scene. This is a picture of the exterior of the church area, which leads to an inner courtyard, where there's a small pool and several souvenir shops. From the inner courtyard, one enters the church itself, which is a rather stark building, only a large circular candle holder over the altar, and just barely seen is the picture. In this picture is the rock from which Jesus gave the bread to the disciples. Finally, behind the rock is a mosaic of the loaves and fish, which is probably one of the most famous mosaics in the Holy Land. The actual narrative begins telling us that Jesus went up on a mountain and was sitting there with his disciples. Now, more than likely, the mountain was a hill, as there are no areas with the extreme elevation of a mountain around the Sea of Galilee. As in the Sermon on the Mount, the reference to a mountain puts Jesus in the role of Moses, which prepares for the bread of life discourse later in the chapter. Further, John gives us a time reference. The Passover of the Jews was near. This is a feast of the Jews. Now, this is the second Passover narrated in the Gospel of John. Hence, a year has technically passed since the temple incident in chapter 2 and this narrative in chapter 6. Then Jesus lifts up his eyes and sees the great crowd coming toward him. And continuing the Mosaic allusion, he asks Philip where they can buy food for all these people to eat. That question parallels the question that Moses asks to God in Numbers 11:13. The editor immediately intervenes to assure the readers that Jesus is not lacking in knowledge. He notes that Jesus asked Philip that question, testing him. Jesus definitively knew what he was going to do. This is yet another example of what I like to refer to as the Johannine editorial 2x4, with which he clobbers the reader with the fact that Jesus is God. Philip immediately answers Jesus with the fact that 200 denarii would not be sufficient, 200 days' wages, to buy food or bread for each in the crowd to have even a little. We're immediately made aware of the immensity of the task at hand. Philip's sidekick, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, has a solution. There's a young boy there, a paideon, who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Well, that's a beginning. But certainly it will not feed a crowd this big. The loaves here are specified as barley loaves, that is, the bread of the poor. Arnold comments, its lower gluten content, low extraction rate, less desirable taste, and indigestibility render it the staple of the poor in Roman times. The fish were probably cooked or pickled fish. Jesus responds to Andrew to prepare the group for a meal. Make the people recline. Then another editorial comment to explain the reclining. There was much grass in the place. Mark's account tells us that there was green grass, which further makes the allusion to Psalm 23:4, where the Lord as shepherd makes his sheep lie down on verdant or green pastures. Then we're told that the males sat, numbering about 5,000. Clearly, there were more than the males around. There must have been women and children. So more than likely, then, the number could reach 10 to 15,000. Jesus then takes the bread presented by the young man, gives thanks, and distributes it to those who were seated. The standard blessing over bread at a meal such as this would run something like, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, blessed are you, O Lord our God, Melech Ha'olam, King of the universe, King forever, who brings forth bread from the earth. And then he does the same with the fish, as much as each desired. Now, there's a slight deviation from the narrative as presented in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Here, Jesus himself distributes the bread, which seems a bit odd considering the size of the crowd. It would be sensible for him to give the bread to the disciples who would then distribute it to the crowd. But John narrates it this way to fit the discourse that's coming. A key in that discourse is he gave them bread from heaven to eat. And so Jesus now gives them bread to eat. When the meal was finished and all were satisfied, Jesus tells the disciples to gather the leftover or the excess fragments in order that nothing would be lost. There's to be no waste. So the disciples gathered and filled 12 baskets of fragments from the 5 barley loaves which were left over from those who had eaten. The Talmud notes that the pieces of bread are not to be thrown around. Food the size of an olive must be picked up. Now, the number of baskets, 12, signifies the reconstitution of Israel, calling the 12 disciples to form the core of a new messianic community. Therefore, from the relatively insufficient 5 loaves and 2 fish, this extremely large crowd was fed, and there were 12 baskets of leftovers. An insufficiency has, in Christ, become a superabundance. Those who experienced this wondrous sign were quick to act. They immediately recognize him as one of the expected ones, the prophet coming into the world. This, on the first level, is the prophet like unto Moses spoken of in Deuteronomy 18:15-18. There will be several connections to Moses in the course of the discourse which will follow. Taking the epithet, the one who is to come, we could see a reference to Elijah, who is to precede the Messiah when he comes. Brown notes that in 1 Kings 19 there is a definite parallel drawn between Elijah and Moses. And the popular expectation in this over John may represent an amalgamation of the two figures, Elijah and Moses. Jesus' reaction to the crowd is just as quick. Realizing that they were about to come and to possibly make him some sort of king, he withdrew to the mountain by himself. The mountain, hill, would more than likely be the same place mentioned at the beginning of the narrative. Several scholars see this refusal on the part of Jesus to be significant. Beasley Murray speaks for them. Jesus' refusal to accede to the multitude's demands must be recognized as one of the turning points in his ministry. For from this time on, Jesus and the crowd seemingly part company. Well, that's about all we have time for in this session. Next time, we'll look at the great Bread of Life discourse delivered at the synagogue in Capernaum, where John presents his theology of the sacrament of the Eucharist. See you then.